Hi there. I'm Brother Merrill, and this is Sunshine for the Soul Inspirational Stories. I appreciate everyone that listens to the stories, and I hope you'll feel the Spirit of the Lord with these stories as I have. I want to say adios to my friend and neighbor Richard Millett. He passed away this week. He was in his 90s. What a great guy. He presided over 3 different missions in his life. He spoke with prophets and apostles. They knew him by his first name, and he had a powerful spirit. He also had quite an energy level. Even in his 80s, he would be out with 2 snow shovels after it snowed, clearing his driveway. I'm glad that he was able to meet his wife and pass through the veil, and I'm sure he's being fitted with factory parts now for that old frame. Congratulations, you endured to the end, Brother Millett. I have some wonderful stories today. I appreciate the listeners that have shared them with me, and I again encourage anyone who has inspirational stories that you'd like to share. You may have kept them close to your heart and not shared them with a lot of people, but I will treat those stories with the respect that they deserve, and the Spirit of the Lord can bear testimony to our listeners of the truth of your experiences. You can find my email in the comments. Jesus Christ tasked 3 of the Nephites, at their request, to administer the work of translated beings on this earth to the Lamanites, the Jews, and the Gentiles across all the land. As a result, we refer to any experience we've had with a translated being as one of the 3 Nephites. I try to listen to the Spirit as I read the stories that people send to me, and when I feel a good, peaceful spirit with the story, I feel it's something I can share with the listeners. I hope that you enjoy these stories as much as I have. They reaffirm a hope that God is watching over us and is aware of our situation, our feelings, and our circumstances. Even in today's world, I have personally had encounters with beings, both seen and unseen, from the other side, often not realizing who they were until after they had disappeared. But a lingering realization accompanies their departure, a sense that you have interacted with the heavenly being. Their appearance may not be distinguishable from other mortal beings, but the power of their presence set these encounters apart. Many of us have undoubtedly had encounters with these beings during our life and not even realized it. In the Book of Mormon, it says they will be among the Gentiles, and the Gentiles will know them not. Gordon Dahl shared a wonderful encounter that his grandfather, Leo Warren Richards, and his son had one day near Arco, Idaho. Leo and his son were returning to Arco after a long journey on horseback, and their journey required them to ride through a desolate black landscape of lava rock. It's currently known as Craters of the Moon National Monument. And it's a harsh area of barren black lava rock that's pocketed with caverns and tubes and crevasses and cracks. And it's hard lava rock. It's igneous rock, and it seems to resist erosion or friction. It just is how it is. And they had encountered an unexpected, unseasonably warm batch of weather, and it had just smothered the area. And as they came home, a strong south wind had brought an oppressive heat. And as they traveled through that black lava rock, it felt like they were in a blast furnace. People that live around these lava flows, there's some up near Arco, there's some down by Fillmore, Utah. When you have several months where you have below freezing temperatures, the water runs down into these cracks and fissures and caverns, and they fill with ice. And during the summer, they're not exposed to the sun, and they're down deep enough that there are pockets of ice and cold water that stay all year long. So these pockets are well known to people who live around these lava flows. But that day, as Leo and his son pushed toward home, they were overcome with the heat. They and their horses were in dire need of water, but they didn't know where any of those ice pockets were in the area that they were in. The men and the animals were about to expire from thirst. And in desperation, Leo stopped and he pled with the Lord in prayer. And he explained the life-threatening situation they were in. And as he finished his prayer, he looked up, and all he could see all around him were waves of heat just rising off this black landscape all around him. But off in the distance, he noticed a small column of dust. And he thought, oh, dust devil too. They trudged along. Their horses were exhausted. They were exhausted. They needed water. And they watched this column of dust as it grew and got closer and closer to them. And they began to fear that they'd soon be overtaken by the sandblasting and the gusting of another hot thermal gust that had brought a dust devil. But they were relieved to see the cause of the column of dust. An old man driving a buckboard wagon drawn by 2 horses rode up rapidly toward them. He stopped and got out and greeted them, and then the old stranger explained that he'd been out in the craters and had loaded his wagon with ice and had filled several large containers with cold water. Then he smiled and said, "Looks like you boys could use a drink." And he generously offered them all the water they needed for them and for their horses. And then he walked around to the back of the wagon and tossed an old rusty tub on the ground and filled it with water from one of the barrels on his buckboard for the horses to drink. Leo and his son dismounted as their horses drank deeply from the tub, and then they filled their canteens with ice-cold water. Leo waited for the horses, and then he loaded the empty tub back into the stranger's wagon. Leo and his son secured their canteens on their saddle and climbed onto their horses. And when Leo turned around to thank the man and offer some money for the water, the stranger was nowhere to be seen. The man, his wagon, and his horses had vanished. As Leo and his son, now refreshed, rode side by side and talking about what they had just experienced, as they moved towards home, his son said, "Dad, do you think that was one of the 3 Nephites?" And as they talked, they began to even wonder if he was real. But they knew the cold water was real, and it had saved the lives of this father, his son, and their horses. Some of my listeners share their stories somewhat anonymously, with only their YouTube username attached, so respecting that anonymity, I have assigned names to some of these stories that they have shared. One of them, we'll call Jake, one of our listeners shared this story. As a young man, he worked for a pest control company in Arizona. During work, he drove a pickup that had all the equipment in the back. I'm sure you've seen those pesticide trucks around town. He had a 200-gallon tank, a pump with a 5-horsepower gas motor, and then a big 200-foot reel of hose that would go back in automatically when he pulled it. And then he had all the other necessary implements that he needed, and it was all attached to a piece of plywood that fit in the back of his truck. The previous weekend to this story, Jake and his wife had gone up camping in the beautiful Arizona mountains. And they'd driven quite a distance after he'd gotten off work, so they had to set up camp in the dark. And as Jake built a fire that night, he didn't notice that his prescription glasses had fallen on the ground. The same thing happened to me one time, Jake. And during the evening, his glasses, unseen by everyone, got ruined as they were ground into the dirt. And Jake's driver's license required him to wear glasses, but he was unable to salvage the frames or the lenses, so out of necessity, he decided to do his best until he could replace them. Monday, Jake was really busy. He depleted completely the contents of the 200-gallon pesticide tank during the morning, and then he used a hose from the last home he was working on, and he mixed 200 gallons of water and the pesticide chemicals into the tank in the back of his truck. He climbed in the truck, and as he pulled out of the neighborhood onto the main highway, his tailgate flew open, and his entire load slid out of the back of the truck. And Jake's heart sank as he watched this heavy load in the rearview mirror and turned around. It slid out of the back of the truck, dropped onto the pavement, and he expected the tank to burst and spill this poisonous pesticide everywhere, but the entire load remained intact, and it was still attached to the plywood as it slid to a stop in the median lane. Momentarily relieved, Jake pulled into the median lane and backed the truck up towards the tank, and cars were flying by in both directions as he got out to evaluate his situation. And a wave of panic swept over him as he surveyed his position. He thought, how can I get this heavy load back into my truck? And when the police came, he knew he was going to get a ticket for losing his load on the highway and for driving without his required eyeglasses. He did feel grateful that at least the pesticides had not spilled on the roadway. As cars sped by in both directions around him, Jake offered a silent, desperate prayer for help. And then moments later, he saw an old station wagon pulling into the median lane coming toward him. As it stopped, a little Native American man got out, and he was dressed in a pinstripe suit with an old-fashioned derby hat and wingtip shoes. As Jake surveyed his odd attire, he noticed that the old Indian was not wearing socks. He thought to himself, how uncomfortable those shoes must be without socks. But the old Indian stepped up to Jake and put out his hand and said, "Where are the police when you need them?" And then he added, "Well, let's pick this up, put it back in your truck." Jake thought to himself, you have no idea how heavy this load is. There's no way the two of us could budge this load. It probably weighs a ton, and you're not any bigger than my little wife. As all these doubts ran through his mind, the old Indian said with authority, "You get on that end of the tank, I'll get on this side. We'll lift on 3. And as he counted, Jake thought to himself, this is hopeless. We're going to hurt ourselves trying to lift this thing. And he had barely gotten his fingers under the plywood when the old Indian said 3, and Jake felt he was barely lifting any of the load at all, but it miraculously raised up. Following the Indian's lead, they set the plywood on the tank end onto the tailgate. Then they came around and pushed the whole sheet of plywood in with its load into the truck. Jake closed the tailgate and checked it to make sure it was secure, and he thought to himself, I hardly lifted a thing. It was all that little old Indian. During the encounter, Jake was just struck. He was unable to speak because he knew this must be one of the 3 Nephites. He just watched the old Indian in amazement. Once the load was secured, the old Indian touched his hat, turned and got back into the station wagon. He made a U-turn and drove back into the same direction he'd come from. And Jake stood and watched in amazement as he disappeared around the bend in the road. When Jake got back to the office, he told his boss what had happened. And he told Jake, that is impossible. Jake knew it was not possible for a regular mortal, but it had just happened to him. When he got home that night, he told his wife, one of the 3 Nephites helped me at work today. Then he told her the whole story. With God, all things are possible. I enjoyed that story. Thank you for sending it in. Another story that touched me. In the 90s, Brenda was a single mother of 3, living in southern Utah. And going through her regular morning routine, running almost on time, she ushered her 3 children out into the car and made sure they were buckled in. And as she closed the back door of the car, she noticed an older man on the other side of the street. And he was dressed in blue coveralls and was coming toward them from the far side of her house. And in a friendly voice, he said, "Good morning. Well, it looks like you have a flat tire." He stepped across the road and offered to help Brenda change the tire. And Brenda didn't even know where the jack for the car was stored. But she sensed that this was a good, godly man. He had an air of peace and surety about him, and she felt comfortable with him. He somehow knew exactly where all the parts of the jack assembly were and the spare tire, and he seemed completely familiar with this specific model of vehicle. Brenda watched in amazement as he quickly replaced the tire. And he put the spare on, and as he worked, Brenda said, "Are you from around here?" And he said, smiling brightly, "No, I'm just visiting." And when he finished, he put the jack back and secured it where it was supposed to be stored. Then he tossed the flat tire into the back of the car. Brenda thanked him and watched as he crossed the road and continued down the sidewalk, on the other side of the street. She had felt a peaceful presence as he had helped her. After he left, she thought, he could not even have seen my flat tire in the carport from the far side of my house. The house blocked the view of the tire. How could he even have known I needed this help? Brenda wanted to thank the old stranger, and so she watched for him, and she asked her children to keep an eye out for him on their street. And every morning and every evening they watched, but they never saw him again. And finally Brenda told her children he must have been one of the 3 Nephites. She said this thought brought a sweet assurance to a struggling young single mother and her 3 children. The Lord is aware of each of us. Not a hair of our head falls to the ground unnoticed by him. It seems that some of the beings from the other side love to sing, some of the heavenly hosts. And another story shared with us by Jace. Jace was one of 3 primary teachers who had been asked to sing a child's prayer at the funeral of a beloved primary child from their ward that had passed away. Jace says that he's not been blessed with even a decent voice, as anyone that knows him will attest. And as a result, when he sings, he does it in kind of low tones and kind of keeps his voice to himself. He does like singing the hymns, but he doesn't want to bother people. At the child's funeral, mourners had filled the chapel and the cultural hall back to the back of the stage. Every seat was full. And after the funeral service, Jace's neighbor commented to him how beautiful his voice was, saying she could hear him clearly from the very back of the cultural hall. And Jace laughed and replied, "Oh, you must mean everyone else who is singing. You know I can't sing." And as he thought about it, he realized he was the only one singing his part in the Lord's Prayer song that day. He said, "It gave me chills when I realized I was not singing alone. That day we either had hosts of heavenly angels or some of the 3 Nephites singing with us." I have one more story I hope you enjoy. Another listener shared that a family friend, Larry, was working alone on a remote house that was under construction in northwest Montana. The outside of the house was completely unfinished, and he was working inside. This was before the days of cell phones, and as he worked, Larry fell off a tall ladder, and he landed on his stomach when he hit the floor. The impact broke both his wrists, and it knocked the wind out of him. He lay on the floor in terrible pain, and he struggled to get up, but without the use of either of his hands, it was difficult to even get off the floor, and he really rang his bell. And as he struggled, a tall man suddenly came through the front door and helped him to his feet. He steadied Larry, and as they walked through the door over the threshold and off the large drop where there was no porch onto the unfinished lot, the stranger then helped him down across the lot over to an old Jeep, and then he helped him into the passenger seat. The quiet stranger drove Larry into the hospital. He stopped right in front of the ER and helped him out of the Jeep, opened the door, then took him through the door of the hospital. The nursing staff rushed out to meet Larry. They could see he was hurt, and they started to check him in. And Larry looked back to thank the man, but he was gone. When he asked the nursing staff if they'd seen where that tall stranger had gone, none of them had seen anyone else. They had not noticed a Jeep out front and said he was alone when he came through the door. There are heavenly beings around us, seen and unseen. Our Heavenly Father is the most powerful being in the multiverse. He has literally millions of his sons and daughters who are helping as his work progresses here on this earth. I want to thank everyone who sent stories today, and it's comforting to know the Lord is aware of each of us. We'll not all be miraculously delivered from each trial, but nonetheless, the Lord is there with us. As we watch the battle between light and darkness raging, it's comforting to know that our God is the most powerful being that exists, and he's our loving Heavenly Father. Everything we experience, is part of our passage through time as we progress towards eternity. If you sometimes wonder, am I even progressing? You might even question if the Lord is aware of you and your struggles. In this world, it's impossible to survive the battle that's raging right now alone. You need to know God is there. He's watching over you. He will guide you, whatever your circumstances, whatever you've done, wherever you are. The Lord is aware of you and will help you in the things that you are doing. If you have any doubt of that, please pause from your normal activities. Consider your life. Consider where you are, what you want to accomplish. Think about the things you have in your life, things that you're grateful for. And then if you will kneel down and ask Heavenly Father, are you there? Do you love me? You will feel the Lord's love pour into your heart and into your mind. He is there. He is a loving Father in heaven. He's all-powerful, and He wants to guide you. And you can come to know His voice and know that He is with you as you proceed through this environment of time. I went to lunch yesterday at Edna's, and we had a great meal again. Thank you, Matt. Edna's, it's a new restaurant down on 250 West Center Street in Provo. Has really good food. The prices are great, and the food is wonderful, so I'd recommend it highly. I'd also like to thank everyone who has sent me their stories. And if you have a story that you'd consider sharing with our listeners, you can find my email in the comment section, or you can share your story in the comment section. I appreciate you watching today. You can subscribe here. And if you like this story, I'm sure you'll enjoy this story about the three Nephites. We've told several of them. And you can listen to all of Brother Merrill's inspirational stories, Sunshine for the Soul, right here. Thank you.